It is late in the life of the British Empire. Across its vast territories, power still speaks loudly through laws, uniforms, and weapons, through institutions designed to command and to be obeyed. Yet within that noise, something quieter is beginning to take shape, a force so slow and restrained that it is almost invisible at first glance. A thin man walks barefoot along a dusty road, carrying no weapon and issuing no orders. His voice is soft, his body fragile, his pace unhurried, and still governments pause when he speaks, prisons fill when he refuses to comply, and an empire begins to falter, not because it is attacked, but because it is no longer obeyed. His name is Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, and this is not a story of battles or victories in the usual sense. It is a story about patience, about restraint, about the belief that moral force, sustained long enough, can outlast violence itself. So settle in now and allow the world to slow down as we follow the quiet life of a man who believed that peace could be revolutionary. This is the peaceful revolution of Mahatma Gandhi. By the time the British Empire finally began to notice him, Mohandas Gandhi was already an old man. His body was thin to the point of fragility, his movements slow, his clothing reduced to little more than a simple white cloth. He did not look like a revolutionary, and that was precisely the problem. Empires are trained to recognize threats that arrive loudly, with banners, weapons, and raised voices. They are far less prepared for a man who refuses to play by those rules, who does not shout, does not strike, and does not hurry. To British officials, Gandhi was an anomaly. He held no formal power, commanded no army, and occupied no official position of authority. He spoke softly, often ambiguously, and surrounded himself with silence rather than spectacle. And yet, wherever he went, the machinery of empire began to slow. Trains were delayed, courts were overwhelmed, prisons filled with people who had committed no act of violence, only the quiet crime of refusal. The system, built to respond to force with force, struggled to respond at all. Gandhi did not seek confrontation in the traditional sense. He did not believe that history was shaped only by decisive moments of action. Instead, he believed in duration, in endurance, in the power of staying with a moral position long enough that the world around it begins to bend. This belief unsettled those who governed India on behalf of a distant crown. They were accustomed to negotiations conducted behind closed doors, to authority enforced through visible dominance. Gandhi offered neither submission nor rebellion as they understood it. He offered something slower, more difficult, and far harder to suppress. To understand why the empire could not understand him, one must first understand what Gandhi was not. He was not a nationalist in the romantic sense, intoxicated by flags and slogans. He distrusted mass emotion and feared the violence that often followed it. He was not a politician skilled in compromise for its own sake, though he negotiated endlessly. He was not a saint, though many would later treat him as one. He doubted himself constantly, questioned his own motives, and subjected his actions to relentless moral scrutiny. What Gandhi was, above all, was disciplined, not disciplined in the military sense, but inwardly. He believed that political freedom without personal restraint was hollow, that independence achieved through hatred would only reproduce new forms of domination. For him, the struggle against empire was inseparable from the struggle against one's own impulses toward anger, fear, and revenge. This made his path extraordinarily difficult, not only for his opponents, but for his followers as well. The British administration searched for ways to categorize him. At times they dismissed him as harmless, a well-meaning eccentric whose influence would fade. At other times they treated him as dangerously manipulative, a man capable of provoking unrest while maintaining plausible deniability. He seemed to invite arrest and then use imprisonment as a stage for moral appeal. He spoke of peace while entire provinces came to a standstill. Each attempt to reduce him to a familiar type failed. Gandhi understood this confusion and did little to resolve it. Ambiguity, for him, was not a weakness, but a form of protection. It prevented his movement from hardening into something that could be easily crushed. His refusal to conform to expected roles forced the empire into a reactive posture, constantly adjusting to a man who would not move where he was pushed. This story, then, does not begin with a declaration of independence or a moment of triumph. It begins with misunderstanding, with an empire confronting a kind of resistance it had no language for. A resistance rooted not in speed or force, but in patience, not in victory, but in endurance. To trace how such a quiet figure came to reshape the destiny of millions, we must go back, far from the corridors of power, to a childhood shaped by duty, faith, and a deep sensitivity to moral consequence. The revolution that would one day unsettle an empire began not with defiance, but with attention. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was born in 1869 in the coastal town of Porbandar, a place shaped by trade, ritual, and long habits of order. His family belonged to the merchant caste, respected and secure, neither wealthy nor poor, but firmly embedded in the social fabric of Western India. His father served as a diwan, a chief minister to local rulers, a position that demanded loyalty, discretion, and an ability to navigate power without ever fully possessing it. From an early age, Gandhi watched authority operate not through force, but through negotiation and restraint, through words carefully chosen and silences carefully kept. The household was governed by routine and moral expectation. Religion was not abstract or philosophical. It was lived daily, woven into food, fasting, prayer, and conduct. His mother, deeply devout, practiced strict vows, enduring long fasts and complex rituals with quiet determination. She taught not through instruction but through example, showing that discipline was something internal, not imposed. From her, Gandhi absorbed the idea that self-restraint was not a loss, but a form of strength. As a child, he was unremarkable in outward ways. Shy, anxious, and deeply self-conscious, he avoided attention whenever possible. He struggled in school, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he lacked confidence. He memorized rather than questioned, obeyed rather than asserted. Where others spoke quickly, he hesitated. Where others competed, he withdrew. This inwardness would later be mistaken for passivity, but even then it concealed an intense sensitivity to moral consequence. Fear played a quiet but persistent role in his early life. He was afraid of the dark, afraid of ghosts, afraid of punishment, and above all afraid of disappointing those who placed moral expectations upon him. Guilt followed closely behind. Small transgressions weighed heavily on him, not because of their practical consequences, but because they violated an internal standard he could never quite silence. This early intimacy with fear and guilt would later shape his understanding of suffering, not as something abstract, but as something lived and remembered. One incident remained with him for decades. As a boy, he secretly ate meat, encouraged by a friend who believed it would make him stronger, more courageous, more like the rulers who dominated India. Gandhi knew this violated his family's beliefs, yet curiosity and the desire to overcome fear pushed him forward. The act itself was small, but the guilt that followed was immense. He could not bring himself to confess, and the silence became unbearable. The lesson he drew was not about food, but about integrity. Strength acquired at the cost of inner truth, he decided, was no strength at all. Another moment came with marriage. Gandhi was married at a young age, as was customary, and later reflected on the confusion and attachment that accompanied it. Desire, obligation, jealousy, and affection intertwined before he had the language to understand them. He would later judge himself harshly for the possessiveness he felt, seeing in it an early example of how attachment could become a form of domination. Even in intimacy, he began to sense the ethical dimension of power. The India of Gandhi's childhood was dense with hierarchy, caste, custom, and colonial presence structured daily life. The British were distant yet omnipresent, shaping institutions, education, and aspiration without fully integrating into the social world they governed. For a sensitive child, this produced a quiet tension. Obedience was expected, but belonging was conditional. Authority was visible everywhere, yet rarely personal. Gandhi absorbed this atmosphere without yet understanding it, storing impressions that would later resurface with unexpected force. What distinguished him even then was not rebellion, but attention. He watched how people spoke to one another, how rules were enforced, how shame operated as a social tool. He noticed the difference between moral authority and mere power, even if he could not yet articulate it. While other children dreamed of becoming strong or admired, Gandhi dreamed of being good, though he was never certain what goodness truly required. This was not the childhood of a future revolutionary in any conventional sense. There were no early acts of defiance, no dramatic awakenings. Instead, there was a slow accumulation of habits, obedience, introspection, restraint, and a deep discomfort with internal contradiction. The quiet boy growing up in Porbandar did not yet imagine resisting an empire. He was learning something subtler and more demanding. He was learning to live with his conscience, to listen to it even when it brought discomfort, and to accept that fear could be endured rather than avoided. In that inward discipline, the foundations of a very different kind of resistance were already taking shape. As Gandhi moved deeper into adolescence, obedience ceased to be a simple matter of following rules and became something heavier, more internalized. Authority no longer appeared only in the figure of parents or teachers. It began to live inside him, shaping his thoughts before they reached the surface. He learned early that doing the right thing did not always bring peace, and that fear could persist even in the absence of punishment. This was not the fear of violence or deprivation, but the quieter fear of moral failure, of falling short of an ideal that was never fully defined. School reinforced this pattern. Education under colonial rule prized conformity, memorization, and deference. The classroom was not a place for exploration, but for repetition. Gandhi performed adequately, though without distinction, reciting what was expected and keeping his doubts private. He admired order and structure, yet sensed that something essential was missing. Knowledge arrived detached from purpose, authority without explanation. He accepted it outwardly, but inwardly it left him unsettled. Religion, meanwhile, grew more complex. The rituals of his childhood had once felt reassuring, a stable rhythm in an uncertain world. Now they raised questions he could not easily answer. His mother's vows, her fasting and prayer, impressed him deeply, yet he wondered whether discipline alone was enough. Was virtue simply obedience to tradition, or did it require something more conscious, more deliberate? These questions remained unspoken, but they marked the beginning of a lifelong tension between inherited belief and personal responsibility. One episode would later stand out as a turning point in his understanding of truth. After committing a small theft as a boy, driven by curiosity and weakness rather than need, Gandhi was overwhelmed by guilt. Instead of hiding the act forever, he chose to confess to his father. He wrote the confession carefully, expecting anger or punishment. His father read the note in silence, tears filling his eyes, and said nothing. That wordless response affected Gandhi more deeply than any reprimand could have. In that moment, he experienced what he would later call the power of suffering freely accepted. The pain he felt was not inflicted from outside. It arose from recognition and compassion. The lessons stayed with him long after the details faded. Fear, too, took on a new form. It was no longer limited to personal failure, but extended to the world beyond his family. Stories of violence, of unrest, of colonial power exercised without accountability, circulated quietly through society. These were not dramatic tales, but fragments, half-spoken warnings that shaped behavior through suggestion rather than instruction. Gandhi absorbed them as part of the atmosphere of his time. He learned caution, the habit of restraint, the instinct to avoid drawing attention. Yet fear did not harden him. Instead, it deepened his sensitivity to the suffering of others. He noticed how humiliation worked, how it could be inflicted casually, and endured silently. He watched servants, clerks, and laborers navigate systems designed without them in mind. Though he lacked the language of politics, he recognized injustice as a lived experience rather than an abstract wrong. The discomfort he felt was not explosive, it settled, waiting. Marriage intensified these inner conflicts. Responsibility arrived early, bringing with it attachment, desire, and a new form of fear, the fear of losing control. Gandhi later reflected on this period with severity, criticizing his own possessiveness and lack of emotional discipline. At the time, however, he simply felt confused. The expectations placed upon him multiplied, while his ability to meet them with clarity lagged behind. He obeyed because obedience was familiar, not because he understood where it led. What emerged from these years was not rebellion, but a habit of self-examination. Gandhi learned to look inward before acting, to measure impulses against an internal standard that was both demanding and unforgiving. This made him cautious, sometimes painfully so, but it also made him resistant to blind enthusiasm. He did not trust sudden conviction, whether his own or others. Certainty, he sensed, could be dangerous if it bypassed reflection. By the time he reached adulthood, Gandhi had become deeply accustomed to living with unease. Fear had not vanished, nor had doubt, but both had been integrated into his sense of self. He did not yet know how these traits would shape his future. Only that force, whether physical or moral, unsettled him. The lessons of obedience and fear had not taught him submission in the way authority intended. Instead, they had prepared him for a slower, more difficult path, one in which conscience would matter more than command, and endurance more than triumph. The decision to travel to England marked the first true rupture in Gandhi's life. Until then, his world had been contained within familiar boundaries: family, tradition, language, and custom. England represented something else entirely. It was the heart of the empire that governed India from afar, a place spoken of with a mixture of reverence and unease. To go there was not simply to study law, it was to step into the source of an authority that shaped daily life back home, while remaining strangely abstract. The journey itself was long and disorienting. Crossing the sea meant more than physical distance. It meant separation from the moral environment that had formed him, from the routines that had given structure to his days. As the shoreline receded, Gandhi felt the weight of expectation press in from all sides. His family hoped he would succeed, bring honor, and return as a respectable professional. At the same time, they feared what England might do to him, how foreign habits and beliefs could erode the values they had carefully instilled. Gandhi carried both hopes and fears with him, uncertain which would prove stronger. Before leaving, he made a series of vows to his mother. He promised to abstain from meat, alcohol, and sexual indulgence, commitments meant to preserve his moral integrity in a world perceived as morally loose. These vows were not casual reassurances. They became anchors, binding him to an inner discipline at a moment when everything external was changing. For Gandhi, the promise mattered less as a rule than as a form of self-definition. In a place where he would be anonymous, the vow was a way of remaining himself. England did not welcome him with hostility. It welcomed him with indifference. London was vast, crowded, and impersonal, a city that absorbed newcomers without noticing them. Gandhi found himself adrift among strangers, his accent marking him as foreign, his manners as provincial. He dressed awkwardly, attempting to imitate English styles without quite understanding them. He spoke cautiously, fearful of ridicule, and withdrew further into himself when conversation moved too quickly. The empire's center did not need to assert its dominance. Its norms were simply assumed. Loneliness settled in quietly. Gandhi attended lectures, read diligently, and followed the prescribed path of a law student. Yet he felt disconnected from the substance of his studies. Law, as it was taught, seemed abstract and procedural, concerned more with form than with justice. He learned the language of rights and obligations, but not how power shaped their application. Once again, he obeyed, memorized, and complied, sensing that understanding would come later, if at all. Food became an unexpected trial. His vow against meat isolated him further, cutting him off from social rituals that revolved around shared meals. At first, he struggled to eat at all, his health suffering as a result. Gradually, through reading and experimentation, he discovered vegetarian communities and literature that reframed his restriction as a philosophical choice rather than a cultural relic. What had begun as obedience transformed into conviction. For the first time, Gandhi experienced the quiet empowerment of choosing restraint rather than inheriting it. This period marked the beginning of a subtle shift. Alone in a foreign city without the immediate presence of family or tradition, Gandhi began to take responsibility for his own moral framework. He read widely, not only legal texts, but religious and philosophical works that explored ethics across cultures. Christianity, Hinduism, Jainism, and Western moral philosophy entered into a private dialogue within him. He did not yet synthesize these influences, but he allowed them to coexist, testing their implications through daily practice rather than argument. Still, confidence eluded him. He remained hesitant, unsure of his place, keenly aware of his difference. England did not harden him or radicalize him. Instead, it reinforced his sense of marginality. He learned what it meant to exist on the edges of a dominant culture, present but not fully included. This experience would later prove decisive, though at the time it felt merely uncomfortable and obscure. By the time Gandhi completed his studies, he had acquired a legal qualification, but more importantly, he had undergone an internal displacement. He was no longer entirely of the world he had left, nor fully at home in the one he had entered. The long journey to England had not transformed him into a confident representative of empire or a defiant critic of it. It had done something quieter and more enduring. It had taught him how to live with uncertainty, how to carry discipline across borders, and how to remain inwardly anchored while standing alone. When Gandhi settled into life in England, he discovered that the greatest challenge was not hostility, but erasure. He was not confronted directly, nor openly excluded. Instead, he was simply overlooked. In lecture halls, in social gatherings, in the everyday flow of London life, he occupied a space that was neither contested nor acknowledged. This invisibility was not dramatic, but it was persistent, and over time it shaped his understanding of power more deeply than any explicit act of discrimination. He attempted at first to adapt. He studied English customs with care, adjusting his dress, his posture, his speech. He joined societies, attended meetings, and practiced public speaking in small, controlled settings. Each effort was sincere, yet none fully bridged the gap. His accent remained a marker of difference, his hesitation a source of self-consciousness. He spoke softly and was easily interrupted. In a culture that rewarded confidence and fluency, his restraint translated into silence. The law, which he had come to master, offered little refuge. Legal education in England was steeped in precedent and formality, designed to preserve continuity rather than question authority. Gandhi learned how arguments were structured, how cases were won, but he sensed that law functioned differently depending on who invoked it. The neutrality he had been taught to admire seemed increasingly theoretical. Justice, he began to suspect, was not an abstract principle evenly applied, but something mediated by social position and power. Outside the classroom, Gandhi encountered English society in fragments. He observed the rituals of respectability, the unspoken codes that governed behavior. Politeness masked hierarchy, and civility often concealed indifference. No one needed to tell him he did not belong. The architecture, the pace of conversation, the assumptions woven into everyday speech made that clear without words. This realization did not provoke anger in him. Instead, it sharpened his awareness. He learned to watch carefully, to listen for what was left unsaid. Vegetarianism, once a private vow, became a point of connection. Through vegetarian societies, Gandhi met people who questioned dominant norms, who spoke of ethics as a lived practice rather than a cultural inheritance. These encounters mattered. They offered him his first experience of belonging based not on birth or status, but on shared commitment. For a man accustomed to isolation, this was quietly transformative. Restraint, he discovered, could create community as well as separation. Yet even here, Gandhi remained cautious. He did not embrace causes quickly or loudly. He preferred to observe, to test ideas against his own experience. He wrote essays, spoke occasionally, and read extensively, but always with a sense of distance. England did not invite him to participate fully in its moral debates. He remained a guest, tolerated but peripheral. This position, though uncomfortable, taught him something essential. It showed him how systems maintain themselves not only through force, but through habits of exclusion so ordinary they appear natural. Public speaking continued to trouble him. When he rose to speak, his voice sometimes faltered, his thoughts arriving too slowly for an impatient audience. Each failure reinforced his sense of inadequacy, and yet he persisted. He practiced deliberately, viewing each discomfort as a form of training. He did not seek to eliminate fear, but to move through it. In this, he was unknowingly rehearsing the discipline that would later sustain him under far greater pressure. By the time Gandhi left England, he had not become confident in the conventional sense. He had not learned how to dominate a room or command attention. What he had gained was something less visible but more durable. He understood what it meant to exist within the structures of power without being fully recognized by them. He had experienced the quiet violence of indifference and learned that resistance did not always begin with confrontation. Sometimes it began with endurance, with the refusal to disappear entirely. This invisibility, endured rather than resented, would later become a source of strength. Gandhi had learned how to move without being noticed, how to listen more than he spoke, how to occupy the margins without surrendering his sense of self. In the heart of the empire, where authority appeared most secure, he had discovered a truth that would guide him for the rest of his life. Power does not always announce itself loudly, and neither does resistance. When Gandhi returned to India, he carried with him a legal education, a certificate of qualification, and a quiet hope that knowledge would translate into purpose. He had studied diligently, absorbed the language of courts and contracts, and learned how authority presented itself in formal terms. Yet almost immediately he encountered a disquieting truth. Possessing the law was not the same as being able to use it. The distance between principle and practice, which had troubled him abstractly in England, now appeared in concrete and humiliating ways. His first attempts at practicing law were marked by hesitation. In the courtroom, surrounded by experienced advocates and rigid procedure, Gandhi found himself unable to speak. His mind, clear in private, faltered in public. Words failed to arrive in time. His voice grew thin, then disappeared altogether. On more than one occasion he sat down in silence, unable to continue. These moments were not dramatic failures, but they cut deeply. He had returned expecting to serve, perhaps even to succeed. Instead, he confronted his own limitations with painful clarity. This inability to perform revealed something essential. The law, as practiced, rewarded confidence more than truth, speed more than reflection. It favored those who could dominate space and language, who could impose coherence through force of personality. Gandhi did not fit this model. His temperament inclined him toward listening, toward careful consideration, toward moral certainty, earned slowly rather than asserted quickly. In the legal world he entered, these qualities were liabilities. Disillusionment followed. He had imagined the law as a tool for justice, a means of correcting wrongs through rational procedure. Instead, he saw how easily it became an instrument of power, enforcing existing hierarchies under the guise of neutrality. Contracts protected those already protected. Courts mirrored the inequalities of the society they served. This realization did not make him cynical, but it unsettled his faith in institutions as such. Justice, he began to suspect, could not be guaranteed by structure alone. Outside the courtroom, Gandhi continued to observe Indian society with a sharpened awareness. Colonial administration touched every aspect of life, from taxation to education, yet it remained distant and impersonal. Indians encountered authority through paperwork, deadlines, and rules imposed without explanation. The law was everywhere, but justice felt abstract, deferred, or selectively applied. For someone as sensitive to moral coherence as Gandhi, this dissonance was unbearable. Financial pressure added to his unease. His legal practice brought little income, and the expectations placed upon him as a returning professional weighed heavily. Family members looked to him for stability, while clients expected competence he did not yet possess. Gandhi felt trapped between obligation and inadequacy, between the role he was meant to play and the person he actually was. The fear of failure, familiar from childhood, returned in a new and more public form. Rather than hardening himself, Gandhi responded by withdrawing further into reflection. He reconsidered his understanding of law, power, and responsibility. If justice could not be delivered through the courtroom, where did it reside? If speech failed him in formal settings, what other forms of expression were possible? These questions lingered without resolution, creating a tension that demanded release. The opportunity came unexpectedly, not as a triumph, but as an escape. A legal assignment in South Africa offered Gandhi the chance to leave India once again, to earn a living, and to distance himself from the sense of failure that had begun to define his return. He accepted, viewing the journey as temporary, a practical solution rather than a turning point. He could not know that this decision would place him at the center of an experience that would reshape his understanding of injustice entirely. At this stage, Gandhi was not yet a leader, nor even a reformer. He was a hesitant lawyer searching for coherence between his ideals and the world he inhabited. Law without justice had revealed the limits of his education and the inadequacy of institutions detached from moral purpose. What he lacked in confidence, however, he made up for in persistence. He remained unwilling to abandon the idea that truth mattered, even if he had not yet discovered how to make it heard. Gandhi arrived in South Africa in 1893, expecting little more than a brief professional assignment. The journey felt temporary, almost incidental, a way to resolve financial uncertainty and regain a sense of usefulness. He did not imagine that this distant colony would become the place where his inner tensions would finally meet the outer world, where the quiet unease he had carried since childhood would find a concrete and unmistakable form. South Africa presented itself as orderly and familiar, shaped by British law and administrative routines Gandhi recognized from his studies. Yet beneath that surface lay a rigid racial hierarchy enforced with an efficiency he had not encountered before. Indians occupied an ambiguous position, tolerated for their labor and commerce, yet denied dignity and rights. The rules governing this system were precise and unapologetic, leaving little room for misunderstanding. One either belonged or did not. The defining moment came early. While traveling by train, holding a valid first-class ticket, Gandhi was ordered to leave his seat because of his race. He explained calmly, showed his ticket, and appealed to procedure. None of it mattered. He was forcibly removed and left shivering on the platform at Pietermaritzburg, alone in the cold night. The humiliation was total, not because it was violent, but because it was casual. No argument was offered, no justification required. His presence itself was the offense. That night marked a rupture. Gandhi later recalled sitting awake, wrapped in his coat, turning the incident over in his mind. Anger flickered, but it did not settle. Fear was there too, sharp and familiar. Yet something else emerged alongside them. Clarity. The injustice he had previously sensed in abstract terms now stood before him, undeniable and personal. This was not a misunderstanding to be corrected, nor a legal error to be appealed. It was a system designed to degrade, operating exactly as intended. In the days that followed, similar encounters accumulated. Hotels refused him, officials dismissed him. Everyday interactions reinforced the same message. Obedience would not guarantee respect. Gandhi could withdraw, endure quietly, and complete his work, or he could respond in a way that aligned with his conscience. The choice was not immediate nor dramatic. It unfolded slowly, shaped by reflection rather than impulse. What distinguished Gandhi's response was not outrage, but refusal. He did not strike back or demand retribution. Instead, he questioned the legitimacy of laws that required obedience at the cost of dignity. He began to see that compliance itself sustained injustice, that participation in degrading systems, however passive, helped keep them intact. This realization unsettled him deeply, for it implicated not only the oppressor, but the oppressed as well. South Africa forced Gandhi to confront a new form of fear, the fear of standing alone. Resistance, even non-violent, carried consequences. Arrest, economic ruin, and social isolation were real possibilities. Yet the alternative, silent acceptance, now appeared intolerable. For the first time, his inward discipline met an outward demand. Conscience was no longer a private burden. It required action. He began cautiously, organizing meetings, writing petitions, and appealing to legal principles the authorities claimed to uphold. These efforts achieved little in practical terms, but they served another purpose. They allowed Gandhi to test himself, to see whether he could act without abandoning restraint. Each step was measured, deliberate, and often uncertain. He learned as he went, adjusting his approach in response to failure rather than success. The wound inflicted at Pietermaritzburg did not heal. It remained open, not as a source of bitterness, but as a point of attention. Gandhi returned to it repeatedly, asking what kind of response could transform suffering without reproducing it. South Africa did not make him a revolutionary overnight. It did something more enduring. It stripped away the illusion that justice would arrive on its own, and revealed that dignity sometimes had to be claimed through sustained, disciplined refusal. This was the beginning, not of a movement, but of a method, a slow, uncertain search for a way to oppose injustice without becoming its mirror. The quiet lawyer who had struggled to speak in court now found himself listening more intently than ever, not only to the world around him, but to the demands of his own conscience. After the initial shock of South Africa, Gandhi did not rush toward confrontation. The injustice he faced was clear, but clarity alone did not dictate response. He understood that reacting impulsively would offer momentary release, but little transformation. What unsettled him most was not simply the cruelty of the system, but the way it compelled participation. Obedience, even when reluctant, became a form of consent. To resist meaningfully, he would have to find a way to withdraw that consent without surrendering his humanity. Gandhi began by observing. He watched how laws were enforced, how fear circulated through communities, how humiliation was normalized through repetition. He noticed that violence was not always spectacular. More often, it was procedural, embedded in forms, deadlines, and routine interactions that left no visible mark yet eroded dignity steadily. The system relied on predictability. People obeyed because they believed disobedience would only worsen their situation. This belief, Gandhi sensed, was the true foundation of power. Standing still became an experiment. Instead of responding with protest or aggression, Gandhi explored refusal, not dramatic defiance, but calm non-compliance. When faced with unjust requirements, he asked what would happen if he simply did not move in the direction he was being pushed. This was not passivity. It demanded attention, patience, and a willingness to endure consequences without retaliation. To stand still in a world designed to move you was to expose the mechanics of force. This approach challenged even those who supported him. Many expected leadership to resemble command, resistance to resemble struggle. Gandhi offered neither. He spoke of discipline rather than victory, of suffering rather than success. He insisted that means mattered as much as ends, that freedom gained through hatred would reproduce the very domination it sought to escape. These ideas were unsettling. They required participants to look inward, to confront their own anger and desire for revenge. Suffering, in Gandhi's emerging view, was not something to be inflicted, but something to be accepted deliberately. This was not a glorification of pain, nor a denial of its reality. It was a strategic recognition that voluntary suffering could disrupt the logic of oppression. When punishment no longer produced submission, when coercion met endurance rather than compliance, authority lost its clarity. The oppressor was forced to confront the moral dimension of their actions, or at least the absence of it. Gandhi tested this insight cautiously. Small acts of non-compliance replaced appeals and petitions. People refused to register, to carry passes, to obey regulations that marked them as inferior. Arrests followed, as expected. What surprised authorities was the lack of resistance. There were no riots, no threats, no counter-violence, just bodies that refused to cooperate and voices that did not rise. The machinery of enforcement, built to crush defiance, struggled with refusal. These moments were not triumphant, they were exhausting. Those who participated faced imprisonment, loss of income, and social strain. Gandhi himself was not immune to doubt. He questioned constantly whether he was asking too much of others, whether his emphasis on restraint masked a form of moral coercion. Each failure, each unintended consequence, forced him to reevaluate. The method was not fixed. It evolved through error and reflection. What distinguished this phase was its slowness. There was no single declaration, no clear beginning. The idea of standing still emerged gradually, shaped by lived experience rather than theory. Gandhi was not yet articulating a philosophy. He was learning through practice, adjusting his understanding of power and resistance in response to reality. Stillness, he discovered, could be disruptive. Refusal, sustained over time, could reveal the fragility of systems that depended on obedience. In learning to stand still, Gandhi found a way to align his inner discipline with outward action. The fear that had once paralyzed him did not disappear, but it lost its authority. He learned that fear could be endured, that suffering did not have to lead to hatred, and that dignity could be preserved even in the face of force. South Africa had opened the wound. Standing still taught him how to keep it open long enough for truth to enter. As Gandhi's approach to resistance took shape, he became increasingly aware that individual resolve was not enough. Standing still in the face of injustice demanded more than personal courage. It required a shared discipline capable of sustaining pressure over time. Resistance, if it was to remain nonviolent and coherent, had to be lived collectively. From this realization emerged an emphasis not on organization in the political sense, but on community as a moral practice. Gandhi began to gather people around him, not as followers seeking instruction, but as participants willing to reshape their daily lives. These early communities were modest and experimental, grounded in simplicity rather than ideology. They lived frugally, shared labor, and accepted hardship as part of a deliberate effort to free themselves from dependence on systems that degraded them. The goal was not withdrawal from the world, but preparation for engagement on different terms. Simplicity became central. Gandhi reduced his possessions, his diet, and his routines, stripping life down to what he considered essential. This was not aesthetic minimalism, nor a rejection of comfort for its own sake. It was a practical response to power. Dependence created vulnerability. The more one needed from an unjust system, the harder it became to refuse it. By lowering material needs, Gandhi believed people could increase their capacity for resistance without bitterness. Labor was shared deliberately. Manual work was not assigned according to status, but embraced as a form of equality. Cleaning, cooking, and farming were understood as disciplines that eroded hierarchy and cultivated patience. In these tasks, Gandhi saw an antidote to domination, a way of grounding resistance in humility rather than pride. The work was slow and often tedious, but it reinforced a sense of mutual responsibility that no political slogan could provide. This emphasis on self-discipline extended inward. Gandhi treated his body as part of the struggle, subjecting it to routines of fasting and restraint intended to clarify intention and expose weakness. Fasting, in particular, served multiple purposes. It was a tool for self-examination, a reminder of vulnerability, and a way of aligning action with conviction. When words failed, the body spoke quietly, drawing attention without threat. Critics accused him of excessive moralism, of confusing personal purity with political effectiveness. Gandhi listened to these objections without dismissing them. He acknowledged the danger of turning discipline into judgment, of imposing standards others could not meet. Yet he remained convinced that resistance rooted only in anger would collapse under pressure. Without inner coherence, non-violence would become strategy rather than conviction, and eventually give way to force. Community life tested these ideas relentlessly. Conflicts arose, fatigue bred resentment. Not everyone shared Gandhi's patience or tolerance for ambiguity. Mistakes were made, sometimes with painful consequences. Gandhi did not pretend otherwise. He recorded failures as carefully as successes, treating them as material for reflection rather than reasons for abandonment. The discipline he sought was not perfection, but attentiveness. What these communities offered was not escape, but endurance. They created a space where people could rehearse the kind of society they hoped to build, however imperfectly. Equality was practiced rather than proclaimed. Authority was provisional, constantly subject to moral scrutiny. In this environment, resistance ceased to be episodic and became habitual, woven into the rhythms of daily life. Through simplicity and shared discipline, Gandhi refined his understanding of power. He saw that domination relied not only on force, but on habits of consumption, aspiration, and dependence. To resist effectively, one had to loosen those habits first. Community, grounded in restraint and mutual care, became the laboratory in which nonviolence was tested, corrected, and sustained. It was here, in the slow work of living differently, that Gandhi's quiet revolution gained depth and durability. As the practices of refusal, discipline, and community life deepened, Gandhi became aware of a problem. What was emerging around him did not fit existing categories. It was not protest in the conventional sense, nor rebellion, nor passive endurance as his critics described it. Without language, the method risked being misunderstood, reduced to weakness or sentimentality. Gandhi believed that naming mattered, not as branding, but as clarification. A name could protect an idea from distortion. After long reflection, he chose the term satyagraha. It combined two concepts that had guided him intuitively for years: satya, meaning truth, and agraha, meaning firmness or insistence. Together they formed something closer to holding fast to truth than to any simple notion of resistance. This was not truth as abstract principle, but truth as lived reality, tested through action and suffering. To practice satyagraha was to commit oneself to truth without coercion, to refuse injustice without hatred. The choice of this term signaled an important shift. Gandhi did not present nonviolence as mere technique, something to be adopted or discarded based on effectiveness. He framed it as a way of being, inseparable from character. Satyagraha demanded consistency between means and ends. One could not seek justice through deception, nor freedom through domination. The struggle itself had to embody the society it aimed to create. This insistence unsettled allies and opponents alike. To those who demanded immediate results, Satyagraha seemed impractical, even naive. To authorities, it appeared irrational. Why would people willingly accept punishment when compliance would restore comfort? The method disrupted familiar calculations of power. It removed the expected response, leaving force exposed without justification. Central to Satyagraha was the idea that suffering could communicate where argument failed. Gandhi did not believe that oppressors would suddenly become compassionate. Rather, he believed that sustained voluntary suffering revealed the moral cost of injustice to everyone involved, including those who enforced it. The aim was not to defeat an enemy, but to transform a relationship. Victory, in the conventional sense, was beside the point. This approach required extraordinary restraint. Participants had to renounce retaliation not only in action, but in speech and intention. Anger, though understandable, was treated as a liability. Gandhi warned that hatred corrupted the struggle from within, turning resistance into a mirror of oppression. This demand was exacting, and many found it difficult to accept. Yet Gandhi insisted that non-violence was not for the timid. It required more courage, he argued, to endure suffering without resentment than to strike back. Satyagraha also clarified Gandhi's relationship to law. He did not reject law outright. Instead, he distinguished between laws that expressed collective moral reasoning and laws that enforced domination. Unjust laws, he argued, demanded disobedience. But such disobedience had to be open and willing to accept punishment. In submitting to arrest, the Satyagrahi acknowledged the social order, even as he exposed its injustice. This paradox lay at the heart of the method. The articulation of Satyagraha did not end debate or uncertainty. Gandhi continued to revise his understanding, responding to failures as carefully as to successes. He resisted turning the concept into doctrine, preferring to treat it as a discipline that required constant renewal. Truth, he believed, could not be possessed permanently. It had to be pursued through attention and humility. By giving his method a name, Gandhi made it communicable without freezing it in place. Satyagraha became a point of orientation rather than a fixed formula. It offered a way to think about power that did not rely on domination, a way to resist injustice without surrendering moral coherence. In naming this new force, Gandhi did not claim to have resolved the tension between conscience and politics. He simply gave it a form through which others could begin to engage it. When Gandhi returned to India after his years in South Africa, he did not arrive as a conqueror or a prophet. He came back quietly, carrying experience rather than authority, and uncertainty rather than plans. India had remained present in his thoughts throughout his absence, yet the country he encountered now felt unfamiliar. The scale was overwhelming, the diversity vast, the suffering diffuse and uneven. What he had learned abroad could not be applied directly. It would have to be tested again, patiently, in a different soil. Gandhi chose first to observe rather than to lead. He traveled extensively, moving through villages and cities, listening more than he spoke. He watched how colonial rule shaped daily life, not only through laws but through habits of resignation and fear. Poverty was not simply economic, it was psychological, reinforced by generations of dependence and humiliation. Gandhi understood that resistance imposed from above would fail. People would have to recognize themselves in it, or it would collapse under its own weight. To many, he seemed an unlikely figure. He dressed simply, spoke softly, and refused to align himself immediately with existing political factions. Nationalist leaders expected fiery rhetoric and clear demands. Gandhi offered questions instead. He asked how freedom could be meaningful if it reproduced inequality. He asked whether independence achieved through violence would simply hand power to new elites. These questions unsettled those eager for swift action. Gandhi appeared cautious, even evasive, at a moment when urgency felt justified. His methods, forged in South Africa, met skepticism. India's scale and complexity dwarfed anything he had previously encountered. Nonviolence, critics argued, might work in small communities, but not across a subcontinent fractured by language, religion, and caste. Gandhi did not dispute these difficulties. He acknowledged them openly. What he resisted was the assumption that violence would resolve them more effectively. Power seized through force, he warned, would not heal division, it would deepen it. Gandhi's insistence on discipline extended to himself. He refined his practices of simplicity, spinning his own cloth, reducing his needs further, aligning his daily life with the values he spoke of publicly. These gestures were often misunderstood as symbolic or theatrical. For Gandhi, they were practical. They reduced dependence on colonial economies and demonstrated the feasibility of restraint. More importantly, they served as a constant reminder that leadership, if it was to be moral, required visible consistency. As his presence became more widely known, expectations gathered around him. People projected hopes and frustrations onto his figure, seeing in him a solution to problems too large to name. Gandhi resisted this elevation. He insisted that no individual could embody freedom for others. His role, as he understood it, was to clarify principles and endure consequences, not to command allegiance. This stance disappointed some and confused others, but it preserved a crucial boundary between influence and authority. In conversations with farmers, workers, and local leaders, Gandhi began to sense the immense challenge ahead. India's struggle was not singular. It was layered, shaped by economic exploitation, social hierarchy, and historical grievance. Any movement that ignored these internal tensions would fracture under pressure. Nonviolence, in this context, was not merely a tactic against colonial power. It was a demand placed upon Indian society itself. Returning home had not resolved Gandhi's uncertainty. It had expanded it. He stood between worlds, shaped by tradition yet critical of it, committed to change yet wary of haste. He belonged everywhere and nowhere, trusted by some, doubted by many. This position was uncomfortable, but familiar. Once again he found himself on the margins, listening carefully, waiting for the moment when attention would need to become action. The stranger had returned, not to claim authority, but to test whether truth could take root on a far larger stage. As Gandhi's influence spread across India, the nature of his struggle changed in ways he could not fully control. What had begun as an inward discipline and a local method now attracted millions. Meetings grew larger, expectations intensified. The quiet practices of restraint and reflection were suddenly surrounded by crowds, slogans, and urgency. Gandhi felt the shift immediately. Power had not been seized, but attention had, and attention carried its own dangers. For the first time, Gandhi confronted the weight of mass participation. Individuals approached him seeking direction, certainty, and reassurance. They wanted clarity in a moment of confusion, permission to act, and someone to embody their anger without unleashing it. Gandhi understood the temptation this presented, to speak decisively, to simplify, to allow himself to become a symbol rather than a person. He resisted this impulse with deliberate care, knowing how easily moral authority could harden into command. Mass movements amplified emotion. Enthusiasm spread quickly, often faster than understanding. Gandhi watched with concern as slogans replaced reflection and imitation substituted for conviction. Nonviolence, he insisted, could not be reduced to obedience. If people followed him without internal discipline, the movement would collapse at the first provocation. He warned repeatedly that satyagraha demanded restraint not only from opponents, but from participants themselves. This message was often unwelcome. It asked too much in moments when people wanted release. The scale of suffering in India pressed relentlessly. Famine, exploitation, and political exclusion created a climate of desperation. Gandhi did not deny this reality. What troubled him was the belief that desperation justified any means. Violence promised speed and emotional clarity, while non-violence demanded patience and ambiguity. Gandhi chose the slower path, not because he underestimated suffering, but because he feared the consequences of unleashing forces that could not be recalled. Leadership became a burden rather than a position. Gandhi refused to issue commands, yet his words carried immense influence. When he spoke, actions followed, sometimes beyond his intention. This responsibility weighed heavily on him. He questioned whether he had the right to ask others to endure suffering without retaliation, whether his own commitment was sufficient to justify such demands. These doubts did not weaken his resolve, but they tempered it, keeping certainty at bay. Violence erupted despite his efforts. Isolated incidents escalated into riots, and riots into cycles of retaliation. Each time this happened, Gandhi felt it as a personal failure. He did not excuse the violence, nor did he disown those responsible. Instead, he examined the conditions that had allowed it to arise. Non-violence, he concluded, could not be proclaimed. It had to be cultivated continuously, especially when fear and anger surged. Gandhi responded not by tightening control, but by withdrawing. When movements turned violent, he suspended campaigns, insisting that moral readiness mattered more than political momentum. These decisions baffled and angered many supporters, who saw opportunity slipping away. To Gandhi, opportunity gained at the cost of principle was no opportunity at all. Freedom achieved through uncontrolled force would carry the seeds of future domination. The weight of the masses revealed the limits of Gandhi's approach and its necessity. He could not guarantee outcomes. He could only insist on coherence between means and ends. This insistence isolated him at times, placing him at odds with those who wanted faster results. Yet it preserved the integrity of the struggle, preventing it from becoming another contest for power. As India's movement grew, Gandhi stood increasingly alone within it. Surrounded by millions, he remained inwardly solitary, anchored to a discipline few fully shared. He understood now that the greatest challenge was not confronting the empire, but guiding a vast and wounded population without surrendering to its most destructive impulses. The weight he carried was not authority, but responsibility, and it pressed upon him with every step forward. Among the countless laws imposed by colonial rule, few seemed as insignificant as the tax on salt. Salt was ordinary, ubiquitous, essential to life itself. It lay quietly on every table, passed from hand to hand without thought, and yet it was tightly controlled, produced and sold under the authority of the empire, taxed in a way that burdened the poorest most severely. To Gandhi, this small, almost invisible law revealed something fundamental about power. Domination did not always announce itself through spectacle. Sometimes it hid in necessities. Choosing salt was deliberate. It was not dramatic nor strategic in any conventional military sense. Precisely because it was simple, it was universal. Everyone understood it. No complex theory was required to grasp the injustice of being denied access to something so basic. Gandhi saw in salt an opportunity to translate non-violence into a form that could be lived by millions without instruction. One did not need training to understand hunger or thirst. The march began quietly. Gandhi walked at the front, barefoot, accompanied by a small group that grew steadily as they moved from village to village. There were no speeches filled with anger, no calls for confrontation. The rhythm was slow, almost meditative. Each step drew attention not through urgency but through persistence. The act of walking itself became a form of communication, visible and difficult to suppress without revealing the violence it relied upon. As the march progressed, the meaning of disobedience shifted. It was no longer abstract or distant. People could see it, join it, and replicate it in their own way. When Gandhi reached the sea and lifted a handful of salt from the shore, the gesture was almost anticlimactic. Nothing exploded, no structure collapsed, and yet something essential changed. A law that had seemed immovable was suddenly exposed as fragile, dependent on widespread compliance to exist at all. The response from authorities followed familiar patterns. Arrests were made, beatings occurred, enforcement intensified. What unsettled the system was not resistance itself, but the manner of it. People broke the law openly and accepted punishment without protest. There was no attempt to overwhelm the state, only a refusal to cooperate with it. The spectacle of disciplined endurance disrupted the logic of repression. Force, applied repeatedly, began to appear excessive and unjustified. Gandhi watched these developments with mixed emotion. He did not celebrate the suffering that followed. Each injury, each arrest, weighed heavily on him. The march was not a victory parade. It was a test, both of the empire's tolerance and of the movement's discipline. Where restraint held, the method revealed its strength. Where anger surfaced, Gandhi intervened, reminding participants that disobedience without nonviolence was simply another form of coercion. The Salt March altered the global perception of India's struggle. What had seemed distant and complex became visible and human. The simplicity of the act allowed observers to see the imbalance of power without explanation. Gandhi did not control this narrative, nor did he attempt to. He understood that meaning, once released, would travel in unpredictable ways. His task was not to manage interpretation, but to remain faithful to principle. Yet even as the movement gained momentum, Gandhi remained uneasy. Success carried its own risks. Nonviolence, once proven effective, could be adopted superficially, stripped of its ethical demands. He worried that salt would be remembered as a tactic rather than a discipline, as a clever maneuver rather than a moral experiment. For him, the march was not about salt at all. It was about demonstrating the shape of disobedience when guided by restraint. The law had been broken, but not contemptuously. Authority had been challenged, but not humiliated. In this careful balance, Gandhi glimpsed the possibility of resistance that did not seek domination in return. The march showed that disobedience could be ordinary, patient, and widely shared. It did not require hatred or heroism, only attention and endurance. In revealing this shape, Gandhi offered a glimpse of how freedom might be approached without reproducing the violence that so often accompanied it. Imprisonment followed naturally. Gandhi had never expected otherwise, and in many ways he welcomed it. Prison was not an interruption of his work, but an extension of it. Where others experienced confinement as erasure, Gandhi treated it as a space for attention. Stripped of movement, noise, and public expectation, he found a familiar rhythm. Stillness once again became instructive. The cell offered little comfort. Time moved slowly, marked by routine rather than purpose. Yet Gandhi did not regard this as wasted time. He listened closely to his body, to his thoughts, to the lingering effects of the movement unfolding beyond the walls. Prison forced distance, and with distance came clarity. He reflected on the actions that had led there, not to justify them, but to examine their consequences without illusion. Writing became central. Letters, notes, fragments of thought accumulated steadily. Gandhi used language not to persuade, but to understand. He questioned whether the suffering endured by others had been necessary, whether restraint had been sufficient, whether he himself had acted from ego rather than conviction. These were not rhetorical doubts. They were genuine inquiries, pursued without the comfort of quick answers. The absence of direct influence unsettled him. Outside, the movement continued without his presence, shaped by forces he could not control. Violence flared unpredictably. Discipline faltered in places. Gandhi resisted the urge to intervene from afar. He believed that moral authority weakened when exercised through distance and instruction alone. Prison reminded him of the limits of leadership, of the fact that no method could guarantee fidelity once it left the hands of its originator. At the same time, confinement sharpened his understanding of power. He observed how the prison system functioned, how rules were enforced mechanically, how individuals were reduced to categories. Guards followed orders without reflection. Prisoners adapted without hope. The environment was efficient, impersonal, and emotionally neutral. In this, Gandhi saw a concentrated version of colonial authority itself, a system designed to operate without listening. Listening then became his counter-practice. He listened to fellow prisoners, to their stories, their fears, their small strategies of survival. He did not preach. He asked questions, offered attention, and absorbed contradictions without attempting to resolve them. Prison, paradoxically, expanded his awareness of human complexity. It reminded him that suffering was never uniform, that moral clarity did not erase individual pain. Fasting often accompanied these periods of reflection. It was not performed publicly, nor announced as pressure. It served as a way of bringing the body into alignment with thought, of reducing distraction, and sharpening focus. Hunger simplified experience, narrowing attention to what mattered most. Gandhi treated it as a dialogue with himself, not as a message to others. Imprisonment also reinforced a difficult truth. Nonviolence did not soften authority, it exposed it. The state did not become gentler in response to restraint. It became more visible. Prisons filled, sentences lengthened, enforcement intensified. Gandhi did not mistake this for failure. He understood that transformation, if it came at all, would come slowly, through accumulation rather than reversal. When release eventually followed, it brought no sense of completion. Prison had not resolved the struggle. It had clarified it. Gandhi emerged with a deeper awareness of fragility, both his own and that of the movement. Listening had taught him restraint anew, reminding him that action without reflection risked reproducing the very domination it sought to undo. Prison had not silenced him. It had refined his attention, preparing him for the negotiations and compromises that lay ahead, where patience would be tested in different, subtler ways. No matter how carefully it was practiced, nonviolence remained vulnerable. Gandhi understood this better than anyone. It was not a shield that could deflect every blow, nor a formula that guaranteed moral coherence once set in motion. As the movement expanded and pressure mounted, cracks began to appear, not in the principle itself, but in the human capacity to sustain it under strain. Violence erupted where fear had accumulated for too long. In moments of provocation, anger spilled over, overwhelming restraint. Gandhi watched these incidents with deep sorrow. Each outbreak felt like a betrayal, not of strategy, but of trust. He had insisted repeatedly that nonviolence was not simply the absence of violence, but the presence of discipline. When discipline faltered, the method collapsed inwardly, even if its outward forms remained. These moments forced Gandhi into painful decisions. When violence surfaced, he suspended campaigns, regardless of momentum or political cost. To many, this seemed incomprehensible. Opportunity was being squandered, they argued, just as pressure on the empire was reaching its peak. Gandhi refused this logic. Pressure built on moral incoherence, he believed, would only produce brittle outcomes. Freedom achieved through fractured means would fracture society in return. Criticism intensified. Allies accused him of idealism detached from reality, of placing moral purity above the urgent needs of the oppressed. Opponents dismissed nonviolence as ineffective, pointing to bloodshed as proof of its failure. Gandhi did not evade these critiques. He acknowledged their force, even when he rejected their conclusions. He did not claim that nonviolence was easy or universally applicable. He claimed only that violence, once unleashed, could not be contained. Internally, doubt deepened. Gandhi questioned whether his expectations were too severe, whether he had underestimated the toll of sustained restraint on people already exhausted by deprivation. He examined his own role in cultivating mass movements without ensuring sufficient moral preparation. These reflections were not public performances. They unfolded privately, often in silence, as Gandhi weighed responsibility against conviction. The fragility of nonviolence revealed something essential about power. Systems of domination relied on predictable responses. Violence, even when justified by grievance, fit easily into this framework. It invited repression, legitimized force, and simplified narratives. Nonviolence disrupted this cycle only when it remained disciplined. When it cracked, the system regained its footing, absorbing unrest into familiar patterns of control. Gandhi responded not by tightening doctrine, but by returning to fundamentals. He emphasized education, reflection, and the cultivation of inner restraint. He spoke less of victory and more of readiness. He reminded participants that nonviolence was not a tactic to be deployed at convenience, but a way of being that demanded continuous effort. This insistence cost him support. Many drifted away, unwilling to accept delays or reversals. These losses did not discourage him. They clarified his priorities. Gandhi preferred a smaller movement grounded in discipline to a larger one driven by rage. He accepted isolation as the price of coherence. The cracks in nonviolence did not lead him to abandon it. They forced him to see it more clearly as a practice constantly threatened by fear, fatigue, and desire for quick resolution. In acknowledging these cracks, Gandhi refused the comfort of certainty. He did not present nonviolence as flawless or complete. He presented it as fragile, requiring care and renewal. This honesty, though unsettling, preserved its integrity. The struggle continued, not as a smooth ascent toward freedom, but as a series of advances and retreats shaped by the limits of human endurance. In those limits, Gandhi remained attentive, convinced that the alternative, however tempting, would exact a far greater cost. As the struggle entered a new phase, confrontation gave way to negotiation. Gandhi found himself sitting across tables from representatives of the empire, men trained to speak in the language of authority, compromise, and delay. These meetings were meant to signal progress, yet Gandhi approached them with caution. Dialogue, he believed, could clarify positions, but it could also obscure truth. The danger was not in talking to power, but in slowly adopting its logic. Negotiation demanded restraint of a different kind. Unlike marches or imprisonment, it offered comfort, recognition, and the illusion of influence. Invitations arrived, formalities were observed, and Gandhi was treated, at least superficially, as an equal. This recognition unsettled him. He understood how easily symbolic respect could replace substantive change, how presence at the table could be mistaken for participation in justice. The risk was subtle but real. Gandhi refused to negotiate as a politician seeking advantage. He did not bargain in terms of gains and losses. Instead, he framed discussions around principles that could not be traded. This approach frustrated his counterparts. They expected flexibility, incremental concession, and strategic ambiguity. Gandhi offered clarity and limits. He listened carefully, responded slowly, and declined agreements that preserved domination under a different name. Critics accused him of rigidity. They argued that compromise was the essence of politics, that refusing partial victories delayed relief for millions. Gandhi did not dismiss these concerns lightly. He acknowledged the suffering that continued under colonial rule. What he rejected was the assumption that compromise without moral coherence constituted progress. Agreements that left structures of humiliation intact, he believed, would only postpone conflict rather than resolve it. These negotiations also exposed internal divisions within the movement. Some leaders favored immediate constitutional gains, even if they fell short of full independence. Others urged confrontation without dialogue. Gandhi stood between these positions, perhaps uncomfortably, insisting that neither abandonment of principle nor escalation of violence would lead to lasting freedom. His refusal to align fully with any faction preserved his independence but deepened his isolation. Power tested him constantly. Delays, procedural obstacles, and carefully worded promises were used to exhaust patience. Gandhi recognized these tactics. He had seen them before, not only in colonial administration but in human relationships more broadly. He responded by slowing further, refusing to be hurried into agreement. Time, he believed, belonged not only to those who controlled institutions but to those willing to endure. The negotiations revealed another truth. Empire did not fear moral argument alone. It feared unpredictability. Gandhi's refusal to conform to expected roles made him difficult to manage. He was not seeking office, nor personal security, nor recognition. Without these incentives, leverage diminished. Power found itself negotiating with someone who did not desire what it typically offered. Still, Gandhi did not romanticize these encounters. He understood that dialogue could not replace pressure, and that negotiation without sustained refusal was empty. The two had to exist together, each correcting the excesses of the other. Non-violence without dialogue risked rigidity. Dialogue without non-violence risked surrender. Leaving the negotiating table, Gandhi often felt unsatisfied. No agreement resolved the deeper contradictions he confronted daily, yet he did not despair. Negotiation, like imprisonment and protest, was another arena in which discipline could be tested. It required listening without yielding, speaking without dominating, and remaining rooted in conscience amid ceremony and protocol. In learning to negotiate with power without becoming it, Gandhi refined his understanding of freedom. Liberation, he realized, would not arrive as a single decisive moment sealed by signatures. It would emerge gradually through a sustained refusal to adopt the methods of domination even when invited to do so. This refusal, practiced patiently, remained his most difficult and necessary discipline. As the struggle wore on, Gandhi's body began to take on a meaning he neither sought nor fully welcomed. Age, exhaustion, and illness made his physical fragility impossible to ignore. His thin frame, once merely personal, became public. Every weakness was observed, interpreted, and projected upon. In a movement built on restraint, the body itself became a site of communication, speaking where words often failed. Gandhi did not treat the body as separate from politics. He believed that how one lived, ate, rested, and endured pain shaped the moral quality of action. Over time, this belief led him to use his own physical vulnerability as a form of appeal, not to force outcomes, but to focus attention. When violence erupted among those who claimed to follow his teachings, Gandhi responded not with punishment or condemnation, but with fasting. He withdrew nourishment from himself, turning inward when the world around him spun out of control. These fasts were widely misunderstood. To critics, they appeared manipulative, a way of exerting pressure through guilt rather than argument. Gandhi listened to these concerns and acknowledged the danger. He insisted, however, that fasting was not directed outward. It was not a demand placed upon others, but a demand placed upon himself. If he could not live with the consequences of the movement, he believed he had no right to guide it. The effect, nonetheless, was profound. As news spread that Gandhi was refusing food, attention sharpened, tensions paused. People confronted their own actions in the presence of his visible suffering. The body, weakened and silent, became a mirror. It reflected the cost of violence without accusing anyone directly. This indirectness was essential. Gandhi did not want obedience born of fear or shame. He wanted reflection born of responsibility. Fasting also served a private function. It stripped away distraction, forcing Gandhi into direct contact with doubt and intention. Hunger simplified thought, reducing complex political landscapes to fundamental questions of harm and care. In this state, Gandhi examined his own role relentlessly. He asked whether he had spoken too quickly, whether he had allowed himself to become a symbol rather than a person, whether his presence intensified pressures he could not control. The public watched closely. Doctors warned him. Allies pleaded for restraint. Opponents waited, uncertain how to respond without appearing cruel. The state, trained to manage bodies through regulation and force, found itself confronted with a body that refused both. There was no law to enforce, no command to issue. The only response available was patience, a quality the machinery of power did not possess in abundance. Gandhi was aware of the risk. Each fast weakened him further, narrowing the margin between discipline and destruction. He did not romanticize this. He spoke openly about fear, about the possibility that his body would fail before the struggle reached resolution. Yet he continued, not because he believed suffering was redemptive in itself, but because he believed attention was necessary, and his own body was the most honest instrument he had left. In these moments, politics slowed to the pace of breath. Time was measured not in decisions or decrees, but in hours endured. The spectacle of force gave way to quiet waiting. Whether this waiting produced transformation was never guaranteed. Gandhi did not claim certainty. He accepted risk as the price of integrity. By allowing his body to become a political text, Gandhi exposed the limits of coercion and the ambiguity of moral influence. He demonstrated that power could be confronted not only through action but through vulnerability, not through domination, but through endurance. The body, frail and finite, carried the weight of a struggle too large to resolve by force alone, reminding all who watched that freedom, if it was to arrive, would have to reckon with the cost borne in flesh and silence. When independence finally arrived, it did not come quietly. It came with celebration and fire, with crowds filling the streets and flags raised high, with speeches declaring the end of empire and the birth of a nation. For many, it was the long-awaited moment toward which years of sacrifice had pointed. For Gandhi, it was something far more difficult to face. Freedom had arrived, but it was fractured, stained by violence he had spent his life trying to prevent. Partition followed independence like a shadow. Lines were drawn hastily across maps, dividing land that had never existed in isolation from itself. Communities that had lived side by side for generations were suddenly told they belonged apart. Fear spread faster than understanding. Rumors hardened into certainties. Neighbors became threats. Violence erupted not as a single event, but as a cascade, one act provoking another, each justified by the last. Gandhi watched as the moral fabric he had tried to protect tore under the strain. The scale of suffering was immense. Trains arrived filled with bodies, villages emptied, millions were displaced, moving across borders that had come into existence overnight. The violence was intimate and chaotic, carried out not by distant authorities, but by ordinary people overwhelmed by fear and vengeance. For Gandhi, this was the deepest wound. Non-violence had confronted empire, but it had not prevented society from turning against itself. While political leaders celebrated the transfer of power, Gandhi moved through areas consumed by terror, speaking to crowds that were often unwilling to listen. He pleaded for restraint, for memory, for recognition of shared humanity. His words, once capable of halting mass movements, now struggled to penetrate the noise of grief and rage. The discipline he demanded felt unbearable to those who had lost everything. Patience seemed like betrayal in the face of fresh wounds. Gandhi felt this failure personally. He did not attribute the violence solely to history or circumstance. He questioned whether his methods had reached deeply enough, whether the moral preparation he insisted upon had been sufficient. Independence without inner transformation, he feared, had released forces that had long been contained by colonial authority. However unjust that authority had been, freedom had removed a constraint without healing the fractures beneath it. At the moment of national triumph, Gandhi stood apart. He did not attend the grand ceremonies. He did not claim credit. Instead, he fasted, withdrew, and mourned. His joy was muted by the knowledge that freedom achieved at such a cost would carry its scars forward. Independence, he believed, was not an endpoint, but a beginning, one that demanded even greater restraint than resistance had. Yet even in this devastation, Gandhi did not abandon his principles. He refused to endorse retaliation, even when it was framed as defense. He insisted that violence committed in the name of survival would shape the future as decisively as violence committed in the name of domination. This position isolated him further, placing him at odds with those who saw compromise as weakness and restraint as denial. Freedom had arrived, but not as Gandhi had imagined it. It was incomplete, unstable, burdened by unresolved hatred. The empire had withdrawn, but the struggle had not ended. It had moved inward into the moral life of the nation itself. Gandhi understood this with painful clarity. The hardest work, he now saw, would not be resisting foreign rule, but preventing newly won freedom from consuming itself. When independence finally arrived, it did not feel like an ending. Flags were raised, crowds filled the streets, and speeches declared the birth of a new nation. Yet Gandhi stood apart from the celebrations. He did not join the processions or address the masses at midnight. The moment that others experienced as triumph reached him as disquiet. Freedom had come, but it had arrived fractured, accompanied by violence he had spent his life trying to prevent. Partition had torn the subcontinent in two, borders drawn hurriedly cut through villages, homes, and memories, turning neighbors into enemies almost overnight. Trains arrived filled with refugees, and sometimes with the dead. The language of victory struggled to coexist with the reality of loss. Gandhi moved through this landscape slowly, listening, walking, fasting, attempting to absorb suffering rather than explain it away. Independence, he believed, could not be celebrated while fear ruled the streets. Many wondered why he seemed withdrawn at the very moment history had vindicated him. The answer lay in the cost. Gandhi had not sought independence as an abstract goal. He had sought a form of freedom that preserved human connection, that refused to exchange one domination for another. The nation that emerged bore the marks of haste and anger, shaped as much by exhaustion as by hope. He did not condemn this outcome, but he could not rejoice in it either. His influence, immense only months earlier, now felt uncertain. Political leaders turned toward governance, compromise, and consolidation. The moral language that had guided resistance proved less persuasive in the tasks of administration and security. Gandhi sensed the shift and did not resist it. He had never wanted power, and now he watched as it moved away from him, carried by institutions he distrusted but accepted as inevitable. Isolation deepened. Surrounded by celebration, he remained inwardly alone. He walked through neighborhoods scarred by violence, speaking quietly to those who had lost everything. He urged restraint where anger still burned, reconciliation where grief demanded blame. His words were not always welcomed. Some saw him as naive, others as obstructive, unwilling to acknowledge the necessity of force in chaotic times. Gandhi listened without defending himself. He understood that moral authority diminished once struggle gave way to statehood. Fasting returned, not as spectacle, but as appeal. Gandhi used his body once more to draw attention to suffering that threatened to become invisible amid political transition. These acts were controversial, misunderstood as pressure or manipulation. To Gandhi, they were a last form of listening, a way of placing himself in the path of violence without weapons, asking the nation to pause and reflect. The loneliness of this period was profound. Gandhi had spent decades mediating between opposing forces, holding contradictions without resolving them. Now the contradictions had hardened into borders and institutions. The space he occupied grew narrower. He did not lament this. He accepted it as the consequence of consistency. His task, as he understood it, had never been to preside over victory, but to remind others of the cost of forgetting restraint. At the moment of triumph, Gandhi stood outside the frame of history's usual celebrations. He did not claim success, nor did he retreat into bitterness. He remained attentive, present, and unsettled. Freedom had arrived, but peace had not. In that gap, he continued his quiet work, convinced that the work of conscience did not end when flags were raised, but became more difficult precisely then. On the evening of January 30th, 1948, Gandhi walked slowly through the garden toward a small gathering for prayer. His body was weakened by years of fasting, travel, and strain, yet his routine remained unchanged. He leaned on the arms of those beside him, not as a gesture of frailty, but as a matter of fact. Dependence, for him, had long ceased to be something to hide. It was part of being human, and he accepted it without apology. The moment itself was abrupt and unceremonious. There was no final speech, no closing reflection offered to history. A man stepped forward, and violence entered where it had always waited, quietly and without hesitation. Gandhi fell, his life ending not in the calm he had cultivated, but in the contradiction he had spent decades confronting. The revolution he embodied did not protect him from death. It had never promised to. News traveled quickly, yet meaning moved more slowly. Shock gave way to grief, grief to confusion. How could a man who rejected violence so completely die by its hand? For some, the question carried accusation. For others, despair. Gandhi himself would not have been surprised. He had never believed that moral coherence guaranteed safety, only that it mattered even when it failed to persuade. In the days that followed, the world searched for a conclusion that did not exist. Leaders spoke of legacy, movements claimed inheritance, statues were planned, quotations repeated, gestures frozen into symbols. Yet Gandhi's life resisted closure. He had warned repeatedly against turning methods into monuments. What he offered was not a system to be preserved, but a demand to be renewed. His death did not resolve the contradictions he had lived with. Violence did not vanish. Power did not retreat permanently. The nation he helped bring into being remained divided, struggling with the same questions he had refused to simplify. Independence arrived burdened with grief, carrying freedoms entwined with loss. Gandhi had foreseen this, though he never accepted it easily. What remained was not certainty, but an echo, the memory of a man who insisted that means and ends could not be separated, who believed that truth required patience, that suffering could reveal rather than erase dignity, and that resistance need not mirror what it opposed. These ideas did not offer comfort, they offered responsibility. Gandhi left behind no final doctrine, only a challenge to act without hatred, to resist without domination, to accept that moral clarity does not eliminate pain, and that peace, if it exists at all, must be practiced continuously without guarantee. His life suggested that the quiet refusal to cooperate with injustice could reshape history, even if it could not protect the one who practiced it. In this sense, the revolution did not end with his death. It became more difficult. Without the man himself, there was no figure to imitate, no voice to absorb projection. What remained was the work, incomplete and demanding, waiting to be taken up by those willing to endure its ambiguity. Gandhi once spoke of the future not as a destination, but as a responsibility carried forward moment by moment. In the stillness that followed his final walk, that responsibility did not disappear. It settled quietly into the world he left behind.